Welcome back to Coffee and Kurosawa, the podcast where a film geek and a film fan swap ideas about the movies they love. My name is Ben Filipkowski. I'm your resident film geek.
And I'm Farrah Sarpkaya, a person who loves film, but like in a super chill, the world is on fire and I want to be reminded that the more things change, the more things stay the same sort of way.
That's right, and today we are talking about High and Low, Akira Kurosawa's 1963 police procedural starring frequent collaborators Toshiro Mifune and Tetsuya Nakadai. So this is easily one of my favorite movies of all time. It is in my letterboxd for favorites. So I'll ask you, Farah, what did you think?
So I knew precisely nothing about this movie when you suggested it, and I loved it, even if it made me feel things. I watched it twice, and both times I was struck by the visual building, which I guess was kind of the point of picking it for our season 2 kickoff. The first half felt like a stage play, and the second half I felt like I was watching a black and white Law and Order episode. It felt super modern, and the number of times I said this effing guy out loud was a lot. It was also weirdly heartwarming at moments, but it feels weird to say that with a lot of the gestures broadly to the world. But overall, I really loved it. I watched it twice this week, in fact, in preparation, partially for necessity and partially just because I enjoyed it. So over to you to actually tell the people what it is.
Yeah. So this is a kind of like a film noir, kind of a police procedural movie. As like a quick summary, concerns Kingo Gondo, who is a wealthy executive at shoe company National Shoes. He's planning a leveraged buyout to take control of the company and opposes another faction that just wants to produce cheap, low-quality footwear. To accomplish this, Gondo has mortgaged nearly everything he has. He does not have a lot of cash to spare. Just as he's about to act, though, he receives a ransom call. His son has been kidnapped. Except it turns out that the abductors mistakenly took his chauffeur's son instead. All the same, the kidnapper, realizing their mistake, still demands the ransom, forcing Gondo to choose between saving the child of his employee or securing his business and, in his own words, his family's future. Under pressure from his wife Reiko, as well as the kind-hearted but implacable Inspector Takura, and, of course, the pleas of his chauffeur, Gondo relents and agrees to pay the ransom. Working with the police, Gondo arranges the drop of the ransom. They drop it from a moving train in 2 briefcases, and Gondo and the police are able to recover the kidnapped boy, yet the kidnappers escape. In the ensuing moments and days that follow, Gondo loses his position and his wealth, but along the way earns the respect and admiration of the public, who hail him as a hero for doing the right thing, and wind up actually boycotting the company he used to work at when it's revealed that they kind of forced him out. Meanwhile, the police track down the kidnapper, who turns out is a resentful medical intern who has killed his accomplices using heroin overdoses. Through a sting operation, the cops catch this guy as he's trying to deliver yet more drugs to kill more people. Though most of the ransom money is recovered, Gondo has still basically lost everything. One of his last scenes meeting with the cops is, literally the auctioneers are in his home, this hilltop mansion, slapping stickers on things to sell it off. All the same, Gondo is now working for a rival company and is invited to meet the condemned kidnapper, who, putting on a very kind of, I hesitate to say brave face, but this like antagonistic face, like whatever, I don't care, eventually breaks down, revealing that his crime was driven by envy. For you see, the kidnapper lived quite literally in the shadow of Gondo's hilltop mansion. He was the titular low looking up at the high, or, as he puts it himself, your house looked like heaven, high up there. That's how I began to hate you. Roll credits.
God, that last shot with Gondo looking at his reflection as the young man has been taken away was just so good. What a note to end on.
Yeah.
And so kind of today, what we're really focusing on with this movie is something that is, again, very timely. Compassion and humanity, just generally, but
Hmm.
also how Kurosawa leveraged blocking and composition to highlight tension, claustrophobia, and power dynamics, which is obviously a very big part of, a multi-millionaire in 1960s era Japan,
Yeah.
versus a medical intern versus all of the folks that they interact with versus his chauffeur and so on. So talk to me about, let's start with, when we say compassion and humanity, because
Hmm.
that's kind of a broad thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What are we actually talking about here today?
So I think to me especially this really strikes me as this movie that is deeply concerned with like class consciousness and class conflict. Like the villain is driven to his villainy through resentment and envy of someone who he perceives as being in this higher privileged position. I mean, it's very on the nose, high and low. Like this guy's high up there, and the villain's way down here.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, high and low is a transliteration of the Japanese title. The Japanese title is Tengoku to Jigoku, which translates literally to heaven and hell. So
Yeah.
when we think of it that way, like Gondo is in this mansion that is, as the kidnapper puts it in the end, heaven, and the kidnapper's living in
Mm-hmm.
hell in these slums way at the foot of this hill. And I don't know, when we're talking about like compassion and stuff, it's almost cartoonish in a way. The kind of like moral quandary of this. It's like, well, are you going to let this kid just die? Like,
Yeah.
obviously not. Who would do that? Like, it's a weird conceit when you kind of like logic it out. Like, who would actually let that occur? But like, it's presented as this almost battle for Gondo's soul. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he is shown to be stern, and I don't know if scheming's the right word, but like, he's planning some sort of underhanded stuff to seize control of his company at the start of the movie. Uh, but he also explicitly stands apart from the people who are trying to recruit him to their side because they're like, fast fashion, baby. Let's
Mm-hmm.
like get these people to spend more money. And he's like, if we just make good shoes, like we'll make more money in the
Yeah.
long run. It'll be better in the
Mm-hmm.
long run for everybody. So he's not here to exploit. He wants to make money. He wants to be successful, but he's not going to exploit people to do that. So I don't know. There's a lot going on in this for as blunt and on the nose as its moral positioning can be. And that moral positioning, I think, boils down to like, we should all just help one another. And, you know, looking at my notes here, by Kurosawa's own admission, speaking in conversation with film critic Donald Ritchie, who's saying, I suppose all of my films have a common theme. If I think about it, though, the only theme I can think of is really a question. Why can't people be happier together? And this is kind of something that kind of pervades a lot of Kurosawa's filmmaking is, it'd be a lot, we'd all be a lot happier if we cooperated more, if we kind of just
Mm-hmm.
helped each other out. And I think that this movie is like bluntly about that.
Yeah, I mean, even when Gondo is given kind of that first scene where he's talking to the other executives for National Shoes, he's like literally ripping up the garbage quality shoe
Yeah.
that they brought of like, the costs are too high. We
Yeah.
have to use this and buy these awful versions. He's like, well, no. Absolutely not. That's trash. No one wants to wear those shoes. No one wants to whatever. And then later on, it's even more explicit when the executives are all like, "Oh, everybody hated him. He
Yeah.
has so many enemies. Everyone thinks he sucks." And then the detective talks to someone who works at his factory. And they're like, Oh, no, I mean, he's a little stern, but if you do your job and, like, you're really good at what you do and you listen and you learn, like, he's actually pretty great. Everybody loves him. I can't think
Yeah.
of a single person who would dislike him. And it speaks a lot, I think, to how he interacts with his chauffeur after the son is taken, and also how he interacts with his wife, because
Mhm.
she literally at one point says, you know, he'll pay the money. I know he will. And at first you think in the beginning, like, it's because she wants to think the best of the man that she married, right? Like,
Yeah.
every spouse wants to think that of their partner. But also, you get the sense that over time, that really is who he is as a
Yeah.
person. He is kind. He believes in equality. He came from lower means. He was an apprentice making shoes back in the day. Like, he
Mhm.
picks up that chisel again to help save this boy. And she, being a very wealthy, heiress, still married him
Yeah.
because he was kind, because of all these things. And so, as we're looking at, his humanity, although we get these snippets of him holding the power, being excluded, literally looking down across hell from heaven as if to play God in the life of this child,
Yeah.
we get the sense that he still holds a lot of that humanity inside him and ultimately makes, the right choice.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how, you know, it's interesting because we get this movie's almost divided in half.
Yes.
And the first half is all in the house. Like, it is
Hmm.
claustrophobic in there. You become intimately familiar with the layout of not even the full house. I think it's almost specifically, almost exclusively the living room with that big panoramic view of, Yokohama and the harbor. It's beautiful. Uh, and that first half is contrasted so wonderfully with the second half of the police doing their work, going out and interviewing everybody. Uh, and you were talking about the detective. I think he's nicknamed the Bosun. He's the cool old guy
Yeah.
on the force, working with Inspector Takura. And uh, yeah, the moment where we get amazing kind of like answer cuts where it's kind of like he's like, yeah, I went and talked to the executives. What a bunch of assholes. And then it immediately cuts to his conversation with those guys. And you're like, oh, I get it now. Yeah, I get it.
Yes,
They're like,
yes.
these executives are talking about how, like, oh, Gondo's just like, everyone hates him. Everyone has a grudge with him.
Hmm.
It turns out the only people who have a grudge with him are the executives who want to make all the money all the time.
Yeah.
And you're talking about how, he can kind of be a little stern, but the implication is very much like, yeah, he can be a little stern, but it's because he has standards. Like,
Yeah.
he's not being harsh or cruel for the sake of being harsh or cruel. He's not even being harsh or cruel. He's just like, no, this is the expectation,
Yeah.
and
We
he
make
doesn't.
good shoes.
Yeah, and he
Yeah.
doesn't expect anyone to do something he won't do himself, which is
Yes.
really cool.
Yeah.
And all that kind of being said, Gondo winds up being this kind of working class hero in a sense, but it reads a little differently in the 2020s, where it's like,
Uh,
we're living in a world where the ultra wealthy are wielding so much power and influence in often callous ways. I have to admit, I'm a little cynical coming into this. Like, I love this movie,
uh,
and I'm a little like, okay, come on, that's a stretch that everyone would be so pure of heart. But
mhm.
by the end of the movie, I'm like, I am moved by it because I do find it very like, if people just care, we can do more
Yeah.
together. I love that idea.
It's funny because as I mentioned, I watched this twice. I watched it once by myself on Tuesday, and then on Thursday I watched it with a group of friends,
Mhm.
particularly American friends, and it was a lot for them to watch. For anyone listening in the future, the date on recording is February 1st, 2025. So, whatever's happened in the future, that's your reference point. And, like, the idea of a quote-unquote good millionaire or a good rich person, will say, depending on if inflation, is just like that cynicism nowadays. As I said, like in my opening quip, the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? Like we
Yeah.
still have inequality, we still have all of these things, but at the end of the day, if people are good people, like I don't know. I It's still like the scene where Gondo's chauffeur literally gets on his hands and knees and begs him to
Mhm.
save his son got me both times. It
Yeah.
like the acting is, I mean, I don't have to say it's a Kurosawa film. The acting was incredible, but like that stark difference in power and the measuring of a child's life
Yeah.
against, 30 million yen in whatever that would be in today's money is like, uh, it's hard to just think like of being able to wield that kind of power over the life of someone else's kid, you know?
Yeah.
Like it feels gross and icky and also, oh God.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. I'm looking at what 30 million yen in uh in 1963 would be converted for inflation. Like this is not like a staggering sum of money. This is like
sure.
Canadian 1.5 million in
I
today's
mean,
money. At
that's
the
still a
time,
lot of money.
yeah, and that's all beside the point. Like the fact that it does boil down so much to like putting a price on someone. It is about putting a price on someone's life
Yeah,
and how that
literally.
works.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the scene where the chauffeur is like on his hands and knees begging and pleading.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and I had a note about, I think it's really close by that. Um, if we rewind a bit before that, the start of the movie, Gondo's like cool, calm, collected. No matter where he sits in that living room, he stands apart. Like he's
Hmm.
always kind of framed and blocked in such a way that he's like this lone bastion of control and authority.
Yep.
And everyone around him is moving, and all this stuff is happening around him. The second that the kidnapper calls, it's like tight shots, tight close ups. Everything is like crunched into a frame. And it kind
Hmm.
of continues down that path for most of the rest of the movie, at least as far as
Yeah.
Gondo is concerned. It's really interesting to watch. And Kurosawa uses like the way that people are arranged in these shots is deeply unnatural. I think we talked about this bit way back when we talked
Hmm.
about Jaws. That sometimes to make something look good on the camera, it just does not make sense in real world logic.
Yeah.
And I really don't notice that in this. Like it's like wow, what a painterly sort of composition, what a beautiful shot. How they have these people arranged that each like face is visible at the right moment. Um,
Hmm.
I also think of like that shot that's like Gondo in profile close up. It's almost like he's back to the camera, but you see the side of his face. He's got the
Hmm.
phone and his wife listening almost
Yeah.
over his shoulder. Like stuff like that is just like this desperation and this tension kind of building. Um, and kind of coming back to the moment of the chauffeur pleading with him. Um, I was just talking about Gondo being cool, calm, and collected, and when the chauffeur's pleading with him, he's like a caged animal pacing back and forth in front of,
Yeah.
like he's trying to get, he's trying to almost, it's like he's trying to use this huge curtain as a shield. So like please, I cannot bear the guilt of you pleading with me right now. I can't handle
Hmm.
this, and he's like trying to get away from it. That really stood out to me, like this profound, like we see this guy being, he's used to being the most important man in a room,
Hmm.
and suddenly he's like, "Oh God, what am I
Yeah.
doing? Who am I? What do I do here?"
Yep. Not like this, please. Not
Yeah,
like this.
yeah, and the fact
Yeah.
that it's Toshiro Mifune, who's like up to this point has really built a name for himself as these like energetic, almost aggressive men, very macho
Hmm.
men taking control of situations or like exploding with passion and rage
Yes.
in some regards, that he's like, he goes from being like, ah, yes, I'm cool, calm, collected, to that passion and that like, suddenly it's like, it's a nervous anxiety is really
Yeah.
fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, for the listeners at home, if you listened to our Seven Samurai episode or have watched Seven Samurai, um, Toshiro Mifune is Kikuchiyo,
Yeah.
the energetic outsider samurai, and so seeing him in this very different light provides a very, I mean, first of all, it shows you how incredible an actor,
Yeah.
because that range, my God, but also that pent up energy actually comes out very well on the
Yeah.
screen. And one thing that you mentioned about unnatural blocking was really interesting to me, because I mentioned like this, the first half feels like a stage play, and specifically it feels like we once or twice at the very beginning see the wall behind the couch, behind where the phone is. Pretty much the rest of that, like, post phone call time, we only see the three walls of the living room and like glimpses into the hallway. And we have the curtain on those big panoramic windows that are remained closed most of the film because they're trying to hide the police from the kidnapper. And, you know, the heavy metaphor here is then eventually the kidnapper is like, no, you got to open the curtains so that I can still see inside to make sure you're not up to some mischief. And he reopens the curtains onto hell. And you're like, oh, stop it, Kurosawa. You're too much. Like, but that awkward framing is like, you're never, like, you're always the audience in this drama. And he plays with that so well with, I think it's the third or fourth, perhaps, call from the kidnapper. When the kidnapper calls and he's in the shower, they grab him from the shower. It's our only time kind of being outside of the living room for quite some time. And he picks up the phone, and then we cut to everybody listening to the recording as he paces around the room, again like a captured animal unable to escape this space. And those cuts kind of, first of all, reminded me a bit of Citizen Kane, because we're building a repertoire here, throwback to season 1 if you have not listened to that as well, but also just the use of, we want to have you listen to this call, but also we don't want Gondo to be stuck in one place on the phone during this very stressful phone call. So we want to let him wander and use the space a bit. And it was very cool to be able to see everybody's thoughtful reactions of being removed from him as he's kind of alone, being like, oh God, I have to make this decision. And it was just so good at that separation.
Yeah, there's a wonderful YouTube channel called Every Frame a Painting. They did this is probably a decade ago now. They did a video on like movement and composition in Kurosawa films, and specifically calling attention to like how Kurosawa will try to make static scenes more interesting by including some element of movement. So whether it is like the background of like falling rain to spice up what is otherwise a really static shot, or a character moving around a static shot to create that dynamism. And we also see that a bit in the like procedural sections, because there's that huge briefing room at the police precinct where whoever is speaking at any given time stands up and is like this figure above the sea of heads and shoulders that we see otherwise. And it's very like, it would be a really dull sequence of shots, but you occasionally get like the cops like fanning themselves or like wiping sweat from their brows, which adds a bit of movement. But every time like a major clue is introduced, like all the cops react like meerkats almost. Like they all move as one, which is really like, it sounds silly to say it that way, but like I I was watching it again last night, and it just like stood out so much to me. Like they get like a slight break in the case, and they all perk up, and they're like, "Oh, that's a thing. Like that's a thing we can work off of," and that's really cool to see. And also in those shots, I think half the cast of Seven Samurai are cops in this movie. So,
Listen, you
which is
got to
also
assemble
great.
your favorites. I
Yeah,
get it. Like,
yeah,
um,
yeah. Because I think the young samurai Katsushiro is in here as a
yes.
Detective Arai. I'm just trying to pull up the actor's name, which I do not have on me. Um, but you'll also spot the frequent Kurosawa collaborator Takeshi Shimura as like one of the higher ups in the police force who's in there, which is cool to me.
Yeah. It's a who's who. It's a
Yeah.
who's who of Kurosawa film. Um,
Also notable is that this is Mifune's 13th collaboration with Kurosawa. They work
my
together.
goodness.
They work together a lot. They only do 3 more movies together after this before they have a falling out.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, and also fun is that immediately, like the 2 years prior to this movie being released, they did 2 action movies together, which
Nice.
we gotta talk about on this podcast at some point. Um,
We'll put a
yeah.
pin in that for season 3. We
Yes.
got to do minimum 1 Kurosawa per season to keep our name. In that same sort of vein, in that detective briefing, I found myself at times being, a little bored because
Mhm.
it's just a bunch of people reading little things of paper and that's it, right? And so when the rest of the detectives perk up, I also perk up.
Yeah.
And it's such a cool little trick because the same
Yeah.
thing happens later on when our lead detective, Tokura, is briefing the media to set up this sting with the kidnapper. And he's telling them all about, these people died and this is how and this is why. And then he's like, but you can't print it. And they're like, what? Why? They are the Greek chorus going, what
Yeah.
is going on? And then he is like, but I want you to do something for me. And it's going to be a statement from the police. And they're like, tell me more, a la Grease Lightning. And they lean forward and he does so. And that use of the chorus kind of, again, harkens back to the first half that is very much a stage play in the classical sense.
Yeah.
And plays really well with who's in charge, who's telling the narrative, who is, really holding all the cards in this moment. And at the same time, one of the newspaper men, after the detective gives them the ask of, hey, I want you to print that one of the $20,000 yen notes were spent as bait, he says, hey, we should also run a spear campaign on national shoes. Unprompted. Because he's like, these guys are jerks.
Yeah.
We should do this thing. And I'm like, huh. You are singing the chorus of our hero, who is, now a ruined, quote unquote, millionaire, but everybody loves him. And it was just a very interesting moment of the hero of the people, I suppose, being stood up in this way, which was kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah. The kind of like, there's a bit of like, there's a bit of like Shakespearean Julius Caesar, like, and Brutus is an honorable man. Or it's like, no, Brutus is not an honorable man. It's like getting them to do something. I don't know. Yeah, I love the kind of. It's so play-like. It's so wonderful. There's actually a great video on the Criterion channel. I think it might also be on their YouTube page with the director Karen Kusama, and she talks about, like, with more eloquence than I can possibly muster. She talks about the blocking in this movie, and highly recommend checking that out. This is, there's so much just neat little morsels to kind of like grab onto with how this thing is shot and composed. You were talking earlier about the kind of like the final scene that the reflection of, it's such a two-way thing, because we learn through the movie that Gondo for want of a nail in so many regards, could have turned out a bit like the kidnapper. Like he had some good breaks and he worked hard. Uh, versus the kidnapper was this promising medical student who did not have quite as much luck or chose a different path that led him down this road. Um, and when they encounter each other, it's across that the prison visitation glass, and
Yeah.
very pointedly you see the reflection of the other person whenever the shot reverse shot thing. So
Yeah.
Gondo is reflected in the glass whenever we're looking at the kidnapper, and vice versa. Um, I love that's such a like, oh, they're a mirror to each other. It's so obvious, but it's so cool. It works so
Yeah.
well. I love that so much.
Yeah, I remember recently there was like news dropped because some executive at some studio was like, we need to make things more obvious and like people need to like say the thing. And like, I hate that, obviously, because that's not good storytelling. But at the same time, if you look at scenes like this,
Yeah.
when they've told you this story, and then in the last 2 minutes they're like, I'm gonna hit you over the head with the story again, as if I'm slamming your face into a book. This is what we're saying. There it is.
Yeah.
And like, I loved that kind of summary. And to your point, a little bit Shakespearean, because in Shakespeare's plays, often we have the narrator who comes out and gives a soliloquy that is a summary of what you just watched,
Yeah.
or the midway through or whatever. And yeah, that framing of the story so starkly after like 2 hours and change of
Yeah.
this, heaven and hell, is just, they're the same guy, barring a little bit of envy,
Yeah.
which in itself is a sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition
Yeah.
that would in fact send you to hell. So it's like a very interesting metaphor here at the
Yeah.
end too that I just love.
Well,
Yeah.
well. Speaking of that, there, in my kind of readings up in my prep, getting ready for this,
Yeah.
there was I read a bit from, and I've already quoted an interview that he had with Kurosawa earlier. The film critic Donald Ritchie argues that this is like structured in some way after Dante's Inferno. And argues he I think he makes the argument that Gondo is this Dante-like figure who is journeying through hell to heaven, which would kind of make the Inspector Virgil. All these characters kind of leading him towards quote unquote salvation.
Yeah.
I think that's a neat idea. I don't know that it's quite that like one to one, but yeah, there's absolutely this idea that like all these characters around Gondo are leading him to do the right thing, to be a good person, to do the moral thing, to do the noble thing, and
Yeah.
to help his fellow man.
So I want to zoom in a little more on the second half of this movie because, like, as we've mentioned, the first half is very much set up like a Greek tragedy stage play, Shakespearean stage play. Take your pick. The second half felt like a detective procedural, and then kind of like an action movie at the end. And there were a lot of really cool shots around our kidnapper that particularly stood out to me. And the one I flagged before we hit record is there's a moment where the kidnapper wants to basically poison his co-conspirators with pure heroin. And he thinks that the first time didn't work because the police did not announce the deaths of these two people. And so he goes and basically hires a escort who is very clearly in like withdrawal from heroin to test how deadly it is.
Yeah.
But as he is picking this one particular woman, there's a very specific shot where it is shot through like a square in some kind of shipping container or something. I don't know
Right.
exactly what it's supposed to be, but there's a sheen off his glasses. He wears sunglasses the entire time the police are following him through this sting. It's at night, it's in jazz clubs, it's all these things. But the sinister framing is so, like, tight on his face, both here and then later on when he's actually about to do the quote-unquote murder of his two conspirators in a bush as he's hiding in wait.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're thinking about compassion and humanity and comparing him to Gondo, who is constantly surrounded by people
Mm-hmm.
as kind of this moral chorus trying to guide him to do the right thing, he is very much alone.
Yeah.
He's always shot alone. And I think there's something very striking about that, particularly with the addition of the sunglasses making him blind to the world around him, or at least, metaphorically so.
Well, and I mean, to continue on that metaphor, if we follow the poetic notion that the eyes are the window to the soul, the fact that he has these reflective glasses on, these lenses that prevent us from seeing who he is, we can extrapolate and get a little more poetic and say, well, then he has no soul. He has sold his soul. He is lost. He is lost and damned. He is in hell. So, I mean, he is constantly in isolation. He is kept apart, or keeps himself apart from others.
Mm-hmm.
And at no point do we get to see any. I shouldn't say that. At some point we do see his humanity, but it's at the very end when he's been caught. So like the kind of like these reflective lenses that he has wind up really kind of reinforcing this idea that like this is an inhuman person doing these terrible things, and and the fact that it is such a compelling and spooky visual, like you're talking about where he's in the amongst the bushes or the shipping container, and it's that tight close up on the glasses, real spooky. When he is kind of walking down the alley behind the woman that he is going to murder, that's also extra spooky because the glasses keep catching the light and reflecting back, and it's like when you see like a dog's or a wolf's eyes in the darkness, and they have that like lambent reflective quality. Oh, it's spooky. It's real spooky, and it works very well. But it's also contrasted with, interestingly enough, when he's in amongst all these like unhoused and addicted people, there's still a community there. Like they still kind of drive him off. Like they know that he's bad news. So that to me, that also stood out. He's rejected in so many ways by the world around him. A lot of that is very clearly brought on by himself, as we find out. But yeah.
I think a big part of it, and obviously they're very heavy-handed with the idea of perspective here, of being in heaven or hell, but also just on that individual level. I mean, being a medical intern is a pretty sweet gig. Like, he's on his way. He's on his way to improving his life, making the world arguably better than Gondo ever would have, just as the man who makes shoes, Not to obviously diminish a shoemaker's impact on the world, but like literally being a medical doctor and saving lives, right? And yet he lets his envy consume him to the point where he is willing to threaten the life of a chauffeur's child to shame a millionaire.
Mm-hmm.
And the ethical quandary there, too, where he's literally going to harm someone of what I would imagine he deems his own caste, using the word slightly incorrectly, is, very telling of, I would rather hurt someone like me and also hurt this rich person than just help people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
it's a very interesting, like, we create our own prisons in a lot of ways based on how we treat others, how we move about the world, and etc. And they really do make a big point of that here.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to say something as trite as hurt people, but in his
Yeah.
final like monologue,
Hmm.
like he's had a bad run. Like
Yeah.
he's lost his family. He's had some bad luck, but instead of turning to community, turning to the world out beyond for that kind of like solace and support, he just breaks completely. I love that final confrontation because it is very much like a mirroring thing going on. And we've seen Gondo be the caged animal in some ways, like earlier in the movie. But in this moment when he's invited to speak to the kidnapper, Gondo is just like, it's not even cool, calm, collect. He's just like, he has compassion and pity for this person. And I think another thing that stood out to me there is that it's Toshiro Mifune as Gondo being this very like compassionate person in this moment, very calm, and the kidnapper, the actor is Tsutomu Yamazaki, is almost doing a Mifune in front
Hmm.
of Mifune. Like he's being this very like the barely seething, simmering rage and resentment that explodes into this huge moment of of anger and frustration and so it's almost like he's now the caged animal and such a powerful little moment in so many ways. I it just
Yeah.
sticks with me.
Yeah. I mean, it really does, like you said, underscore the power of community and the power of choosing love,
Yeah.
which, again, sounds very trite. But if we think about, there's a line early on that mention that I think it's the detective or maybe his second in command or former second in command says to Gondo, like, you're not going to listen to your wife who's telling you to pay the ransom on this boy when it's her fortune that let you be the man you are today, or something like that.
Yeah.
And, on the one hand, they're talking about money, obviously. She's rich. She is from a very good family. She's had servants her whole life. We at first see her in very traditional Japanese
Hmm.
dress. But also, if we look even just a little bit deeper at literally, like, she loved him and loves him. Like, it's very
Hmm.
clear throughout the movie she loves him and their family. Her love and her support and her being the angel on his shoulder,
Yeah.
both figuratively and literally at times as they're listening to this phone
Yeah.
call, has helped him be a better man,
Hmm.
right? And to keep him grounded in what's actually important at the end of the day is we're alive and we're happy and the child is safe, and that's it, right? Um, and rather than turning away from his wife, who is his, guiding light here, he listens to her ultimately, whereas our kidnapper does not. Or does not have someone, or does not accept the love of someone. We don't really get to find that out. And that's an interesting kind of question that I was left with, at least, of if we had gotten to know the kidnapper a little more in terms of his existence in the world outside of, the snippets that we saw of him, one wonders how he got to this point. You know what I mean? Like, we don't get a lot of that other than I just kept looking at that house on that hill and it infuriated me. But also, we see him at work. Right? Like, we see him in his doctor's scrubs, and
Hmm.
we see him being, in theory, part of that group, but also every other shot of him, not just the ones in the sting, but when he's like walking to his apartment or whatever, he's walking alone.
Yeah.
He doesn't engage with anyone on the street. He doesn't talk to anybody. He calls the trash collector or the trash burner. I'm not sure what the exact job that guy has.
Yeah.
Um, he calls him Pops, and that's about it. The man knows nothing about him, so he's not like part of the community. He's just by himself, and one
Yeah.
wonders if that's by design or just fate.
I mean,
Who knows?
he reveals in the end that his mother died recently,
Yeah.
relatively
Oh,
recently.
okay.
So I think
Right.
that's the
Yep.
only connection that he seemed
Mm-hmm.
to have.
Yeah.
but it's like, again, it's not for like that might have been the only connection he has,
Hmm.
but it's not like he's actively looking for more connections either.
Yeah.
So certainly, yeah, um, the people that he does engage with, like he asks Gondo for a light. Like he bumps into him on the street and like he's
Mhm.
smoking a cigarette, puts out his own cigarette, goes over to ask Gondo for a light, gets the cigarette lit, and the cops are like tailing him at this point, and they're like, "What is this guy doing? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on?" So he's a fascinating character, arguably because we don't know so much about him.
Yeah.
I guess we're able to map a lot onto him ourselves based on our own experiences, so
Hmm.
that becomes really interesting. But also kind of talking about the kind of moral compass of the movie being Reiko, Ganda's wife, the inspector, and of course the chauffeur's just pleading nature. There's also kind of like a very um, paternalistic angle to a lot of this, in that
Hmm.
like the old money is still like are providing some moral guidance, like, or like certainly tradition is providing some moral
Yeah.
guidance because Reiko is presented in traditional Japanese clothing more frequently throughout this movie, which is obviously like a class thing,
Yeah.
but there's certainly that element of like, you know, I have trouble not reading it as like it is the responsibility of these upper classes to look out for other people,
Yeah.
which is a very traditionalist sort of thing that kind of gets twisted around
Hmm.
over time and history. But that's something that kept popping into my mind as I was
Yeah.
watching this.
Well, I mean, it's not an uncommon thing in a lot of cultures. Like, I mean, I know for myself, my grandparents back in Turkey were landowners, they were farmers, they were reasonably well off, and as part of their tradition and part of their faith, a lot of their money went to charity. They
Yeah,
went to, helping to house unhoused people, feed people who were having, problems with accessing food, and funding people to go on the Hajj, like
yeah.
all sorts of things, right? And that's a big part of a lot of cultures,
Oh
traditions,
yeah,
is if you are well off, and again, this is without the sprinkling of like humans tend to spoil things sometimes. And I won't point specific fingers, but boy, howdy. Um, a lot of traditions are if you are of a group that is more well off, more fortunate, whatever, share the blessing. You know what I mean? Like, it's not for you to hoard. It's for you to make the world that much a better place. And I think that's a good tradition to highlight here too, of like our doctor friend could have used his position as a, blooming doctor to help people,
yeah,
but instead he chose, no, I'm going to do this instead.
yeah. I
So,
This is making me think of all things, the I think it's the 2012 movie, The Amazing Spider-Man,
yeah.
with Martin Sheen as Uncle Ben.
Yes.
And this is like a quote that has stuck with me, but the I had to look it up to make sure I'm getting it right. He's talking to Peter Parker, and he says, your father believed that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's
Yeah.
what's at stake here, not choice, responsibility. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like the idea that like if you can help someone, you should help them is the heart of this movie. Uh,
Yes.
and I think that is part of why it resonates so strongly with me.
Hmm. Particularly because in the end, we learn that Gondo has returned to his roots. He's still a manager at a factory at one of the competitors, and he got a bunch of his money back, so he's probably doing mostly okay.
Yeah,
And the whole country seems to love him because of the sacrifice that he made. And the, there was no like he wasn't planning on the whole country loving him
Yeah.
after this happened. He wasn't hoping that some rival would hire him. He wasn't planning on being fired, but, he made that community band together. He pushed for change in this big organization that was like, well, we'd rather make cheap shoes and let a little boy die because he's not rich. So it's like, okay, that sucks. Let's look at this other company who's better. And like standing up that morality and the broader community implications of that, so poignant.
Yeah.
Particularly as we are recording today.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we'll try not to be too on the nose about current real world applicability. Suffice to say that when I love that when Gondo makes the decision that yes, he's going to do the right thing, it's not even like it's not really begrudging, if that makes sense. It's like he's all in when he makes the decision. And then when he's on the train doing the drop and arranging things, like he is right there every step of the way. He does not hesitate. He is actually terrified that he will get something wrong. And he's also the one to put, I think they have the pink smoke capsules in the briefcases. And he's the one who's able to find the spot to hide them because he's used to working with leather. He's, he's used to working with his hands. He knows how to do this thing. And the cops are kind of like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
You're
like, we should find a
You're
specialist.
kind
And
of
he's
awesome.
like, nah.
Okay. And they trust him implicitly to do the right thing. And of course, when he makes the drop, they get off the train at the station. Gondo's the first one out and racing down the road, shouting for the kid, and like wraps him up in a big hug. And I'm like, oh God, my heart.
Yep. I know.
And it's so like, if this movie were not so sincere in its belief, those moments later on where Inspector Takura and the other cops are like, hey, do it for Mr. Gondo. They hit hard because you're like, yeah, like he did the right thing. It's amazing. It's, I don't know. I find it so heartwarming. Just so like affirming in so many ways.
Yeah. We are getting close to the end and we have not talked about the chauffeur's absence. And I want to touch on that so quickly and then we have to start wrapping.
Yeah.
Because in most of the movie, the chauffeur, who is the father of the kidnapped boy, is very often notably absent from most of the conversations being had about everything.
Yeah.
He is not a main character. He is there purely as a symbol, perhaps, but a power acting upon Gondo to be like, you have please save my son. He's his only child. His wife has died. This is his legacy.
Yeah.
Whereas Gondo's legacy that he's scared to give up is his money.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting, dichotomy. But his absence from so many of the scenes strikes me so much in the power dynamics where literally he does not matter.
Yeah.
He is the father of a kidnapped kid. He does not matter.
Yeah. Like we see him in those early scenes. He's off to the side and in the background in like a pointed way, though, especially when it becomes clear that it's his son, Shinichi, who has been kidnapped instead of Jun, who's Gondo's son. And that kind of the way that he's positioned off to the side, you can't ignore him. He's like he becomes the elephant in the room, and I think that's very much the point.
Yeah.
But then his absence later on, to me, kind of reinforces some of those like paternalistic elements, where it's like, well, of course, Gondo is of this station, and therefore he is the one responsible for making these decisions, which supersedes the father. Which that's kind of where I'm coming from with those. There's that very like old school traditionalist paternalism, even as it is like a benign or like noble of heart take on that. Yeah. So it becomes very like odd that he's not there. But I also don't notice it because of how the movie kind of like sweeps you up in it. So
it's the power of absence in this film is so striking
Mhm.
in reflection of the power of Gondo's actual, like, his physical presence, but also how they put him up on this pedestal.
Mhm.
Really, really double clicks on that
Mhm.
story that they're trying to tell of who has the power, who is morally responsible,
Yeah.
and ultimately who is going to make the decision to save a life.
Yeah.
So,
5
so
stars. 5 stars.
it's so good. I mean, you can't. We have to jump to the. We have to jump to the closing summary now because we are getting close to time.
Yeah.
We could talk about this movie forever, and we did off camera before we even hit
Yeah.
record. But to sum up the last hour
Yeah.
ish, Ben, if you wanted to learn about blocking in this film, why this movie?
Why this movie? I think this movie, if you want to learn about blocking, like I would just point to the entire first half.
Mhm.
Every shot in there, the way that the actors are arranged is this is such a talk heavy movie. And that first half would be dreary as could be were it not for how they've blocked it out, how they arrange the actors, and how the camera captures that space. This is for such a dialogue heavy movie that relies so much on that exposition. It moves really fast in that first half, and it's all in this tightly confined space. It is all in this tightly controlled and artificial space, and you don't notice it. And I think that's just the power of how it is shot and blocked to keep things moving, to keep you engaged and interested in what's happening. And the idea that these kind of tableaus of still life almost explode into movement in those moments of tension is like amazing to see and to experience.
Yeah.
But if you're just looking to watch something on a Friday night, why pick High and Low?
So, if you're just looking for something to watch on a Friday night, I would watch this on a Friday night, but my only caveat is only do it if you're really in the mood for something with some heavy social commentary. Because, like, as I mentioned, I watched it on Thursday with some American friends, and it was a lot for them. And, it's visually striking. It's surprisingly modern. Like, it felt like, you know, despite the absence of, like, cell phones, there were walkie-talkies. There was basically a modern Law and Order episode, right?
Yeah.
But it definitely is a lot heavier than you might expect.
Yeah.
And so if you want to watch it just for funsies, go into it with that in mind.
Yeah. And I'll take this moment to add one last note that in this year, 2025, I believe we will see an English language remake of this movie coming out on Apple TV. It's going to be called Highest to Lowest. It will be directed by Spike Lee and starring Denzel Washington. I don't necessarily think we
Fascinating.
need a remake of this, but if it gets people to watch more Kurosawa, I'm all for it. And of course, when Denzel and Spike work together, they don't miss. So,
Amen to that. Um, so then let's dive in as we are at the end of our episode to the fun stuff. First thing first, the socials. So we are moving off of the Meta platforms. So going ahead, you can find us at Patreon as Coffee and Kurosawa. You can also find us on Blue Sky as at Coffee Kurosawa Pod. You can find me on Blue Sky, Substack, and Letterboxd as Farrah Sarpkaya and as sarpkaya.ca, where I lend my voice as a voice actor. Ben, where can the people find you?
I'm proud to say that this season I have a steady and consistent answer for this question. You can find me on Blue Sky as at the Benjimon and on Letterboxd as at Benjimon. And I think with all that out of the way, what have we got coming up next?
So if you want to watch along at home before our episodes drop, the next few movies we're looking at are, Ben, please help me.
Sure. If you want to watch
Please help.
along at home, the next few movies we're looking at are Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio,
Thank you.
George Lucas's Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, and Vincent Ward's What Dreams May Come.
Thank you. We are going to be looking at how stories change and adapt over time, how films highlight the conflicts we face within ourselves and in the world around us, and why so many painters and artists wind up flocking to film.
That's right. It is going to be a jam-packed season. Grab your popcorn and join us as we talk all things film. As always, thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.